Welcome to the Education Corner, a podcast by Education Choices magazine.
Education Corner podcast would like to welcome Dr. John Taylor, Director of Learning, Teaching and Innovation. Cranleigh is one of Surrey's leading co-educational independent schools, offering boarding and day education for pupils from 13 to 18. Cranleigh provides a breathtaking range of opportunities in a school small enough for everyone to know and support each other. Pupils lead busy lives, exceeding in academic and sporting expectations, while preparing for life beyond its beautiful rural location. Welcome to Education Corner podcast, John. Please do explain to us your role as Director of Learning, Teaching and Innovation at Cranleigh School.
Well, thank you, Chloe. Lovely to be with you. Yes, it's an unusual post. I've been at Cranleigh for the last 8 or so years, and my job, in essence, is linked to what we term Cranleigh thinking, which is to say, we think that education is better, it's richer, it's more enjoyable, it's more rewarding for both students and teachers if instead of simply teaching those all-important facts for the next test, we teach beyond the test. And what lies beyond the test is a rich world of questions, problems, challenges where, bluntly, life doesn't give us a mark scheme answer. So I enjoy, for example, engaging in philosophical conversations with students and with my colleagues. I've been instrumental in pioneering qualifications such as the extended project, which we use extensively, and other project qualifications. And this is all a long-winded way of saying anything we can do to encourage Cranleighans to be thoughtful, reflective, inquiring, independently minded young people who don't just ask, what do I need to know for the next test, but realize that real learning is something much deeper and richer than that. And that, for me anyway, has involved work in qualification development, it's work with colleagues to support them in the classroom, and work obviously with students in facilitating them on their own learning journeys.
And can you tell us a little bit about the ethos and values at Cranleigh beyond that?
I think Cranleigh, we've characterised the school in terms of the qualities and dispositions that we want Cranleighans to exemplify when they leave us. And I've already mentioned one of those, Cranleigh thinking, refers to our aim to promote thoughtful, reflective, inquiring young people who can take a question and pursue it deeper and further, perhaps, than is required by the syllabus, but in an independent and critically reflective way. We also balance that with an emphasis on what we've called Cranleigh being, which characterises the nature of the individuals that Cranleighans become. Are they comfortable within themselves? Are they secure in who they are, in their own identity in the world? And from that basis, are they able to reach out in positive ways in relating to others and in making their mark in wider society? And that third dimension is what we call Cranleigh giving, which refers to our charitable aims, our philanthropic enterprises, and our wider aim of producing individuals who will go out looking to say, what can I give back as I have received so much? What can I give back to the world? So, and those three, they are our strategic objectives: Cranleigh thinking, Cranleigh being, Cranleigh giving. That informs all that we do in the classroom, outside the classroom, in terms of our pastoral care and in terms of our whole school development. So we've really tried very deliberately and intentionally to structure our approach to learning around the kind of individuals that we want Cranleighans to become.
And such a wholesome and caring atmosphere as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you came to be at Cranleigh and your personal background?
So I've 25 years in secondary boarding. Prior to that, I was in higher education, teaching at Oxford and elsewhere. I left higher education just at the turn of the millennium. And really, I'm somewhat of a hybrid, really. My graduate work had involved physics and philosophy. And so I've always been interested in transcending disciplinary boundaries and also in just opening up questions in the classroom. As I've already alluded to through our Cranleigh Thinking initiative, it's so much more rewarding if you go into a lesson and ask a question to which you don't actually know the answer yourself. I discovered that very early on, actually, that if I'm working my way through a physics class and we're learning Newton's laws of motion, pupils might very studiously write down the notes and do the exercises. But if I were to drop into the lesson a question such as, but what is time? Or how is motion possible? Because after all, if there's an infinity of points between any two different points in the universe, and you can't do an infinite number of tasks. How can you actually move from one point to another? This is Zeno's paradox. I found actually just from experience that these questions have a sort of catalytic effect on young people. They really energize the reaction, and the thought processes just start happening because they're, immediately gripped. And so really what I've been trying to do for years in education, through philosophy, through dialogue, through inquiry, project work, is just give some space for these questions and more open-ended challenges to be explored and to actually form a very significant part of the learning journey. So I began that work, as I said, at my previous school, an independent boarding school in the Midlands. And sort of 16 years on, having got some of that going there, I came to Cranleigh and was given the brief by the headmaster to do more of it. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
Just so we understand, you're obviously responsible for the learning, teaching and innovation. Can you tell us more about what work specifically that's involving?
On a day-to-day basis, a lot of my time is spent in the classroom, either teaching or with colleagues. As I've mentioned, we've expanded our curriculum to include project work, EPQ in the sixth form. Cranleigh also partnered with Northeastern University in London to set up a new qualification a few years ago called the School Certificate in Philosophy, effectively akin to EPQ, as something which we can do with lower school, year 9, year 10 students, giving them an opportunity to begin that journey of inquiry. So I spend time with colleagues supporting them as they support children in these classes, a certain amount of teacher training, a certain amount as well of auditing lessons, just reflecting with colleagues when I see these activities happening in the classroom and encouraging that, and then promoting the idea that this is something we're all doing. And actually, perhaps we just need to become more aware of it and have a language to use to describe what we're doing. And the other part of my work is increasingly with our international schools. We have schools now in China. We're in the Middle East. I'm in frequent contact with them online and through visits, looking to support the work that they're doing and to help them as well as they find their own interpretation to place on these approaches.
It sounds very exciting. I certainly like the idea of the school certificate in philosophy. Now, obviously a hot topic. We covered a lot of it in our last edition, something that universities, schools, everyone is having to address as a part of our lifestyles going forward. And Sam Altman has also got a lot to say on the matter. But how do you feel with AI it could be used by teachers and students to enhance the learning process? And do you feel that there are risks associated?
No, you're right. It's certainly the topic of the moment, isn't it? I think for me, the starting point is to demystify the AI a little bit. And what I mean by that is perhaps a couple of things. The first is that for those of us of a certain generation, as soon as we think about robots and artificial intelligence and so on, the sort of 1980s sci-fi movies come to mind. And of course, there are the bleak, dark images of robots sort of destroying everything, terminating everybody. And so, that's a very unhelpful, worrisome model to have in mind. Another question, of course, which came up early on when we all started to become aware of these technologies was this slightly, again, worrisome thought that they were in some sense genuinely sentient or aware that they were processing information as much as other human beings would. Personally, I think all of those models just need to be sort of put to one side quite deliberately. And we just need to start with the simple fact that this is a tool. It's a device. It's something we use like we use our computers every day. And as any tool, it's neither good nor bad in itself, though, of course, it can be used in good and bad ways. And I think it's so important to keep that in mind because, we think of the stories about the Victorians running out of the cinema as they saw the first ever film of a train coming towards them. It's very natural psychological human reaction when technology comes along, which is new and unfamiliar, to panic and to think the worst. And of course, these fears are almost always misplaced. I think we start there. We think of it as a tool. We demystify it. We try to take the emotional temperature down a little bit. So some of the statements that are coming out on social media, positive and negative, probably need to be reined in a bit. And then we actually just start to look at what it does. And what does it do? Well, if we take ChatGPT, what does it say on the tin? It's a generative pre-trained transformer. It generates text by transforming what's already there out on the World Wide Web. At its simplest, it's just obeying one simple rule, which is to say, if I knew the whole of the internet and you started a sentence, how should I finish that sentence? What are the most likely letters to come after this letter, given the background knowledge of the entire internet? That's really all it's doing. I mean, it's amazing what it does following that simple rule, but that is what it's doing. And so I think, therefore, that like teachers have assimilated, we've taken on board the internet, we've taken on board Wikipedia, we've taken on board Google, at some extent, we've allowed ourselves to make use of social media in the right settings, in the right ways. All of these technologies, teachers have a way, I think, of looking at them, learning from them, and just almost naturally helping them to find their way into the classroom. And there are lots of very obvious ways in which it can be used very effectively, particularly if we have learners who are struggling to organize their thoughts, and a language-based assistant could be just the thing they need. Or teachers who are a bit pressed for time, and they just need some stimulus ideas. And this is going to curate for them much more quickly and efficiently the content of the internet rather than having to do all that searching themselves. And then risks. Well, yes, but in line with my don't panic approach, I personally am not persuaded that the risks are, shall we say, qualitatively different from the risks we already have had to face. They're things like accuracy, the hallucinatory tendency of the machine. There are issues about data protection and privacy, ethics, bias. But what I'm describing is basically the syllabus for a Year 9 digital literacy class that we're already teaching. We already have to deal with the fact that children may access inappropriate content and need to be protected in all sorts of ways against that. So I'm yet to be convinced that this is giving us a whole set of new risks, although I would accept that it's, shall we say, amplified some of these noises, and that some of these issues are now more centre stage in a more vivid way. But my own view, as I say, is that we should have been, and are indeed, preparing children for this kind of a world already. So it's very much a don't panic for me.
There's obviously a lot going on. And in our last edition, we covered AI and different schools and universities also and their views. But are you seeing that the curriculum is evolving in response to this development?
Is it evolving? The answer is not yet. Should it evolve and will it evolve? The answer is yes, I think it will. I'm old enough again to remember the days before the internet, where your school project meant you actually needed to head down to the library or find a newspaper and cut something out from it. There was a genuine challenge about access to information for lots of students. And now that challenge has really gone away. I mean, the problem is not the access to information. The problem is the access to too much information or the wrong information. So it doesn't make sense for teaching to continue on the paradigm model that the teacher's main role is to be a provider of information, if the information is really literally at all of our fingertips as it is all the time. So the direction has to be towards a focus on how that information is used, teaching much more about the evaluation rather than just the acquisition of information. And also, I would say, and this is not just driven by AI, I think AI is one of the contributing factors, but there are others. I would say we need to shift towards a more deliberate, intentional focus on preparing and helping young people to be problem solvers rather than just assuming that they're going to spend 16, 18 years getting ready to join in with big challenges that humanity is now wrestling with. We need young people in those challenges. We need them to be engaged right away, and we need to be open to what they have to say. And I think that will mean and is going to bring about a shift in the focus of the curriculum.
In a recent short article that you wrote that's been shared with me, you talk about the R relationship. Can you explain that a little bit further?
That's right. So I was riffing there on the classical 3 R's. My paradigm for responding to AI is based around, first of all, responsibility, that there needs to be safety guardrails in place. Obviously, first do no harm is the first principle of medical ethics, and it could be the first principle of pedagogic ethics as well. We have to make sure that whatever else we do with AI, our children are safe. That's fundamental and of paramount importance. So responsibility is there as a starting point. Beyond that is what we've just discussed, the reform of the curriculum and the reform of assessment. That's a conversation I and others are having at the moment. As I say, it's not just driven by AI, but AI, I think, is going to really turbocharge that whole conversation. And it's just not going to be feasible for us to continue to ask students to be working for large parts of their school career on problems that can be solved almost instantaneously by a clever robot. We need to look much further. But the third R, which is the relationship, I think is also of pivotal importance in our response to AI. Because just as I want to demystify the robots and explain that they're simply tools, they're not teachers, so I also want to say that they aren't humans. And there is a very distinctively human-centered, anthropocentric element to teaching and learning. We go back to the apprenticeship model. We go back to the idea of learning by mimesis, by emulating someone who's inspired you. You know, maybe this is a fault in us as humans, but I don't think we can get inspired in that way by a machine. It's ultimately the person, the teacher in front of you and their relationship to you that actually generates that response, which is actually the starting point for a lifelong journey of learning. And so the relational aspect, I think, has always been at the center of teaching. But again, I think one of the effects that AI will have is to, as it were, intensify our focus on the human, social, emotional, and affective aspects of learning, because that will be our bit. You know, we will get to the point at which the machinery will be able to automate many of the processes that go on in the classroom at the moment. And the teacher will need to have the supervisory eye on all of those. But the teacher's contribution will be to provide the human touch and the relational dimension that no machine is ever going to be able to reproduce.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we've all learned from COVID is the fact that when everyone was isolated and no longer had that human interaction, even if they did have access to a laptop and Google and were able to do Zooms, one of the biggest impacts that it's had on that generation of children going through school was the mental health and the social interaction and the ability to socialise, which is, I think, possibly a huge lesson to us all. I have made a small note here because a lot of people are celebrating AI for slightly different reasons, thinking about more social mobility and the fact that it may now mean that children who perhaps aren't able to access everything that people say at Cranleigh are getting as a part of their education, it may also enhance their learning. Do you have any feelings or views on that?
Yes, I mean, as I said, it's a tool, and a tool can be quite effective and enable you to achieve in new ways. And if one of the effects is that access to certain parts of the educational process becomes much more widespread, we could envisage a ChatGPT-based teaching assistant that could, for example, enable language learning to happen. I dare say that's already been devised by somebody, and that could be made instantly and freely available. I mean, there's been fascinating work done by the academic Sugata Mitra when he's taken computer terminals and literally plugged them into the wall in an area of New Delhi or Bombay or somewhere, and then watched as children have gathered around and taught themselves. Actually, they've got a remarkable facility, taught themselves, first of all, how to use the computer, but then secondly, began to acquire significant amounts of information for themselves, self-organized learning environments, he calls them. But one of the things, just to come back to my basic theme of why I don't think teachers are all going to be superannuated by ChatGPT, he also noticed that they reached a certain point in the learning journey where they needed the support of a mentor. And so he set up a very enterprising arrangement whereby they could have video calls from, I think his phrase was grannies in the cloud, retired teachers and so on who might be in Stockport or somewhere dialing in to Bombay just to chat to these children and to say, oh, that's fascinating what you've learned, and doing very little more than being a human presence. And in his research, he found that provided a further boost beyond purely the technological advantage that he was providing for them. So I think there's no doubt it's a very encouraging and promising sign that the ongoing growth of technology should properly used, should be very powerful for leveling up. But again, as to say, it's going to be working with rather than a replacement model.
We obviously, through the magazine, through our consultancy, we have huge interaction, as I'm sure you do, working at Cranleigh. And we're very aware that parents increasingly are very nervous about the use of technology at home, the use of laptops, Kindles, Chromebooks. And whilst any parent that we come across accepts that is part of the modern era, there is also a feeling of back to books, and pen and paper and everything else. How are you at Cranleigh addressing this?
You're right. And I saw just this week, actually, I think it was Sweden having been known for its technological prowess and for really leading the way, they've gone back to pens and paper, certainly with their early years education. Cranleigh's been on an interesting journey. I mean, we've now fully embraced technology in the sense that we're an iPad school. We set the majority of our assignments online. Google Classroom is used pretty much now for all prep. So we're fully digital in that sense. But at the same time, we're quite discriminating in what technological access we allow. So we don't have phones for our year nines, and we restrict access. In fact, we even have some limitations for our sixth form. At the end of the evening in a boarding house, some of them might be handing their phones in. And there are very obvious reasons why we think that that's pastorally and educationally the right balance. The wider question about assessment, I mean, at the moment, assessment is still paper-based insofar as it exists in the exam system. And I suspect that will change, but I don't think that's going to be a rapid change. It's a conversation I'm certainly interested in pursuing, and I know other schools that are. I think I would say probably the best way to describe it is to say that Cranleigh is on a journey, that we're not particularly ideological, either pro or against classical approaches or technological approaches. We try to be guided by the values that I was describing at the start, and then to be discriminating on that basis.
I've had different heads that I've spoken to. They're beginning to envisage very different classroom layouts, perhaps more digitalised, bigger screens, immersive teaching. How do you see the future of education with AI now as a tool that's available for all?
It's fascinating, actually. These changes sometimes happen and you almost don't notice how much has changed, but it suddenly occurs to you. And that occurred to me recently when I suddenly realised that, probably having spent months of my life in a photocopy room, I'd hardly ever been in there in an entire year. I'm now almost paperless in my classroom. Another change which is happening, again, it's partly intentional and it's partly evolutionary. Classroom spaces are changing. We're making more use of breakout spaces, round tables for discussion. We have a 3D room now in the arts department. We have studio spaces which are, there for the students in their art design lessons, but might also be dropped in on. I've had philosophy students who've gone to record their interviews and their podcasts and things in a music studio during the philosophy lesson. So I think all of these changes are happening, some of them planned, some of them just happening quite naturally. And I think that what underpins it for me is I'm with John Dewey, actually, in thinking that the centre of gravity does need to shift more towards the student. We're still, for all of the right reasons, education is still a very teacher-centric profession, but society, the world is moving on. And one of the things that we're learning about in almost every space at the moment is diversity, the psychological diversity, the neurodiversity, the cultural diversity of students. That, in the end, is going to mean quite a big reconfiguration of a essentially rather standardized educational process. So it's an exciting time to be in the classroom and be part of it.
It's very exciting, and I think that there's so much opportunity, but there's also at Cranleigh so much outside space that I'm sure that when you're not working on laptops and using AI, I'm sure the children very much enjoy the grounds and all the wonders that brings with it too. Thank you so much, John, for giving up your time. And as I said earlier, before we started recording, I'm very much looking forward to coming and visiting Cranleigh soon.
Look forward to seeing you.